Alarms tore through the scrapyard station before I even had my boots on. Red light bled through the porthole above my bunk, painting the walls the color of warning. I rolled out, grabbed my tool belt out of habit, and only then remembered there was nothing to fix yet. The auction hadn't even started. Whatever was screaming through the station's speakers had nothing to do with me. Or so I thought. My name is Owen Hale, and 3 days earlier I had placed a bid on a ship that every engineer in this sector had walked away from. Not sold, not scrapped for parts. Walked away from, the way you walk away from something that scares you and pretend it doesn't. The alarm cut off as fast as it started. A drill, the station computer announced flatly, apologizing for the disruption. My heart was still hammering as I sat back down on the edge of my bunk, staring at my hands. Steady enough, calloused enough, hands that had rebuilt hyperdrives out of parts 3 species said couldn't work together, hands that had patched hull breaches with nothing but sealant foam and stubbornness, hands that were about to touch something no one else in this end of the galaxy wanted to touch. I splashed water on my face in the tiny sink bolted to the wall and looked at myself in the scratched metal mirror. Human, unremarkable, by galactic standards. No exoskeleton, no bioluminescent markings, no extra limbs, no impressive lineage stretching back 10,000 years of interstellar conquest. Just 2 eyes, 2 hands, and a mind that refused to accept the word impossible without checking for itself first. The auction house was 3 decks down, in a wide chamber usually reserved for cargo inspections. By the time I arrived, the crowd had already thinned to almost nothing. That told me everything I needed to know about how today was going to go. A Velmerian auctioneer stood at the podium, his long neck craning over the room with obvious impatience. Around him, maybe a dozen buyers had gathered for the earlier lots: mining equipment, obsolete shuttle parts, a crate of navigation beacons nobody wanted anymore, routine junk, routine buyers. But when the lights dimmed and the holoprojector flickered to life above the platform, showing the outline of the ship up for final bid, half the room actually got up and left. I watched them go. A Kethrani trade broker shook his head and muttered something about wasted air. 2 Selowin engineers, recognizable by the twin ridges running down their skulls, exchanged a look I didn't need a translator to understand. Even the auctioneer seemed relieved when the room started emptying, like he'd been dreading having to describe the ship at all. The hologram rotated slowly above the platform. Even in miniature, even compressed into blue light and static, the ship was massive, longer than anything in this station's berths. Its hull was scarred in places that looked less like combat and more like something had tried to peel it apart from the inside. Panels hung open along one flank, frozen mid-repair by whoever gave up on it last. Lot 41, the auctioneer said, not even bothering to hide his boredom. Designation unclear. Salvage registry lists it only as Forgotten Class, Hull 7. Recovered adrift near the Corvain debris field 11 years ago. Reactor unresponsive. Primary computer core corrupted beyond standard recovery protocols. 3 prior engineering contracts have examined this vessel and terminated their agreements without completing repairs. A pause. Nobody moved. Starting bid 1,000 credits, he said, and I could hear in his voice that he expected silence. I raised my hand before he finished the sentence. The auctioneer blinked his second set of eyelids, the ones Velmerians use when genuinely startled. The human bids 1,000. Nobody countered. 12 seconds later, the ship was mine. That should have felt like a victory. Instead, walking back to my berth with the ownership transfer glowing on my wrist display, I felt something colder settle into my chest. Not doubt. Not yet. Something closer to the feeling you get standing at the edge of a drop you haven't measured, knowing you're about to jump anyway. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept pulling up the ship's scan data on my tablet, flipping through blurry sensor readings and half-finished repair logs left behind by engineers who had given up. Their notes were short, clipped, frustrated. One line, left by a Salowin technician, stuck with me longer than the rest. Whatever built this ship did not build it to be understood. Recommend total decommission. I read that sentence maybe 20 times before I finally closed my eyes. The next morning, station gravity felt heavier than usual, though the readouts said nothing had changed. I made my way to berth 19, where the salvage crews had towed my new acquisition the night before, and stood in the observation corridor, looking through the reinforced glass at my ship for the first time up close. It was worse than the hologram suggested, and somehow, standing there in the pale light of the docking bay, it was also more beautiful than anything I had ever owned. The hull plating wasn't like anything I recognized from the standard shipyards. It had a strange, layered texture, almost like scales overlapping scales, dark gray shifting to deep blue depending on the angle of the light. Whole sections near the bow were blackened, not with rust or corrosion, but with something that looked deliberately burned, as if the ship itself had been designed to survive fire from the inside. A voice behind me made me turn. "You're either very brave or very stupid," said a woman leaning against the corridor wall, arms crossed, a data slate tucked under one elbow. Her name, I would learn within the hour, was Grace Whitmore, one of the few other humans stationed on this rim outpost, working logistics for the salvage yard. She had the kind of tired, sharp look people get after years of watching other people's mistakes cost them money. "Maybe both," I admitted. "You know, 3 separate engineering firms walked off that ship," she said. "Not quit, walked off. One of them left equipment behind because they didn't want to go back inside for it." I read the reports. "Then you read the part where nobody can even agree on who built it." I had. The registry listed the hull as unclassified origin, which in galactic shipping terms usually meant one of 2 things. Either it was so old that its manufacturer no longer existed, or it belonged to something the trade authorities preferred not to name out loud. Neither answer filled me with confidence. Both filled me with curiosity I couldn't quite explain. "I'm going to fix it," I told her. She studied me for a long moment, and something in her expression softened, just slightly, from disbelief into something closer to reluctant respect. "You're going to need a bigger toolkit than the one on your back. I've got time. You've got a reputation to lose," she said. But there was a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth as she said it. "Good luck, Owen. You're going to need it." She left me alone with the ship, and for a long while I simply stood there, watching it through the glass, feeling the strange pull of something enormous and broken, and waiting. By midday I had my authorization codes cleared, and the airlock cycling open for the first time. The air inside was stale, recycled 1,000 times over, by systems that had barely been limping along on backup power for who knew how long. My handheld scanner lit up the corridor ahead, in pale green light, throwing long shadows across a hallway that stretched further than any ship this size should reasonably have. The first thing that struck me wasn't the damage, it was the silence. Most derelict ships hum, even dead ones. Residual charge in old capacitors, settling metal, the faint whisper of environmental systems clinging to the last of their power. This ship had none of that. It felt less like walking through a broken machine and more like walking through something that was simply waiting to wake up. I made my way toward what the salvage records marked as the primary systems core, moving carefully over sections of decking that buckled unnaturally under my boots. Whatever violence had been done to this ship, it hadn't happened all at once. The wear patterns told a longer story. Stress fractures repaired and then reopened. Panels welded shut by hands that weren't human. Wiring rerouted so many times that entire bundles had been left tangled and abandoned, rather than traced back to their source. When I finally reached the core chamber, my scanner readings spiked so hard I thought the device had malfunctioned. The reactor housing in front of me was unlike anything in any manual I had ever studied. Not human tech, not Velmarian, not Salowan, not Kathrani. The architecture was layered in ways that seemed to defy simple engineering logic. Coils wrapped around coils, conduits branching in patterns that looked almost organic rather than designed. I crouched beside the access panel, running my fingers along a seam in the metal that hummed faintly beneath my touch, the first sign of life I had felt anywhere on this ship. "All right," I said quietly, to no one, to the ship, to myself. "Let's see what you're hiding." I spent the rest of that day just cataloging. Not fixing, not yet. Cataloging. Every burned conduit, every stripped wire, every strange unfamiliar junction box that didn't match any schematic I had access to. By the time I climbed back out through the airlock, exhausted and covered in decades of settled dust, The observation deck lights had already dimmed for the station's night cycle. Grace was waiting near the corridor exit, arms crossed again, though this time there was no teasing in her expression. "Well?" she asked. I thought about how to answer that honestly. It's not broken the way they said it was broken. What does that mean? It means 3 engineering teams walked away because they didn't understand what they were looking at, I said. Not because it couldn't be fixed. Grace tilted her head slightly, studying me the way you study someone deciding whether or not to believe something impossible. You've been on that ship for 6 hours. Long enough to know it's not finished being interesting. She let out a short laugh, more surprised than amused. You're serious? Completely. For a moment, neither of us said anything, the hum of the station's ventilation the only sound between us. Then she shook her head, not in disagreement, but in something closer to disbelief mixed with reluctant admiration. You're going to need help, she said finally. Real help, not station gossip and rumors. I know. And you're going to need parts nobody stocks anymore. I know that too. She studied me a moment longer, then reached into her jacket and pulled out a small data chip, pressing it into my palm before I could ask what it was. Contact list. People who owe me favors, people who might actually know something about pre-collapse hull architecture, if that's really what you're dealing with in there. I looked down at the chip, then back up at her. Why help me? Everyone else thinks I'm wasting my life on scrap. Grace shrugged, though the gesture didn't quite match the seriousness in her eyes. Because someone has to be the first person crazy enough to try. Might as well be someone I can say I knew before they either succeeded or got themselves killed. She turned and walked off down the corridor before I could respond, leaving me standing there with the chip in my hand and the weight of an entire dead ship settling into my thoughts. That night, back in my cramped berth, I didn't sleep so much as drift in and out of half-formed plans. Diagrams sketched themselves behind my closed eyes, systems I hadn't fully mapped yet, somehow already connecting in my mind, the way puzzle pieces sometimes arrange themselves before you consciously understand the picture they're forming. 3 engineering firms had walked away from that ship. 3 firms that, as far as I could tell from their public records, had never once tried what I intended to try in the morning, approaching the ship not as an alien mystery to be decoded from the outside, but as a machine to be understood from the inside out, piece by piece, wire by wire, with nothing but patience and the stubborn refusal to admit defeat. It wasn't confidence, exactly, that kept me awake that night. It was something quieter and more dangerous than confidence. It was certainty that I was about to find something no one else had been willing to look for. And somewhere in the dark, deep inside that silent, waiting hull, something that had slept for longer than any record could account for was about to feel the first true attempt in over a decade to bring it back to life. I had no way of knowing, lying there in the dim light of my berth, just how right that feeling would turn out to be, or how far it would eventually carry me, and everyone around me, into places none of us were prepared for. For now, all I knew was this. Tomorrow, I was going back inside that ship, and this time, I wasn't leaving until I understood exactly what I had bought. Morning on the station never really felt like morning. The lights simply shifted from dim blue to a warmer white, and the corridors filled with the same recycled air as always, but somehow my body still understood the difference. I was up before the shift bell, already dressed, already thinking about conduits and junction boxes before my eyes had fully adjusted to the light. Grace's data chip sat on my small fold-out desk, still unopened. I plugged it into my tablet while chewing through a ration bar that tasted vaguely of synthetic grain and scrolled through the names she had given me. Most were unfamiliar. A retired engineer living 2 systems over. A parts broker with a reputation for finding things that officially didn't exist anymore. A historian, of all things, who apparently specialized in pre-collapse hull architecture, whatever that meant exactly. I sent messages to all 3 before I even left my berth, then headed straight for the docking bay. The ship looked no less intimidating in the morning light than it had the night before. If anything, seeing it again after a night of half-formed dreams about its internal wiring made it feel even larger, even stranger, like a puzzle that had grown more complicated overnight simply by existing in my thoughts. I wasn't alone at the airlock this time. Two figures stood near the boarding ramp, and I recognized them before I even got close enough to make out their features clearly. Salowin engineers, the twin ridges on their skulls unmistakable even from a distance. My stomach tightened slightly. I had a feeling I knew exactly why they were here. "You're the human who bought the wreck," the taller of the two said as I approached. His voice carried the flat, clipped tone Salowin speech patterns often took when translated through standard implants. "I am Verin. This is my colleague, Dessa. We were part of the second engineering contract assigned to this vessel." "Owen Hale," I said, extending a hand out of habit, before remembering most species on this station didn't share that particular gesture. Verin looked at my hand with mild confusion, before simply nodding instead. "We came to offer advice," Dessa said, her voice softer, though no less firm. "Not to discourage you, to warn you." "I'm listening." Verin exchanged a glance with his colleague before continuing. "The reactor architecture inside that ship does not conform to any standard power distribution model. We spent 4 months attempting to map its systems before our contract was terminated. In that time, we made exactly one confirmed discovery." "Which was?" "That the ship's internal design assumes the operator already understands it," Dessa said. "There are no clearly labeled systems, no standardized junctions. It behaves less like a vessel built for a crew and more like a vessel built for something else entirely." That last sentence settled uncomfortably in my chest, though I kept my expression neutral. "Something else like what?" Neither of them answered immediately. Verin's throat ridges flexed slightly, a gesture I had learned during my years working salvage yards usually indicated discomfort. "We don't know," he admitted finally. "That uncertainty is, in part, why we withdrew. But you didn't withdraw because the ship was too damaged," I said slowly, putting the pieces together. "You withdrew because you didn't like what you were starting to understand about it." Dessa's translator carried something almost like a sigh through its flat tone. "You are perceptive, for a human." I chose not to comment on the backhanded nature of that compliment. "I appreciate the warning, but I'm still going in." "We assumed as much," Verin said. He reached into a satchel at his side and produced a small data drive, offering it to me the same way Grace had the night before, as if sharing forbidden knowledge had simply become the standard greeting for anyone associated with this ship. "Our full survey logs, everything we mapped before we stopped. It is incomplete, but it may save you time." I took the drive, genuinely surprised. "Why give this to me? You could sell this information." "Because no one wants to buy uncertainty," Dessa said simply. "And because if you succeed where we failed, I would rather understand how than wonder for the rest of my career." They left without another word, walking back down the corridor with the particular stiff-backed posture Salowin used when trying to hide unease. I stood there a moment longer, turning the data drive over in my hand, feeling the weight of everything I still didn't know pressing down harder than it had the day before. Then I turned, cycled open the airlock, and stepped back inside. The interior felt different in daylight hours, though of course there was no actual daylight this deep inside a docked hull, only the pale glow of my handheld lights and the occasional flicker of ancient emergency strips still clinging to a trickle of residual power. I made my way back toward the system's core, this time with a plan, instead of simple curiosity guiding my steps. I plugged Verin and Dessa's data drive into my portable terminal and let it sync with my own scans from the day before. Slowly, a clearer picture began forming across my display, not a complete map, but enough overlapping detail to start making real decisions. The Salowin team had been right about one thing. The wiring inside this ship didn't follow any conventional logic. Standard vessels routed power in predictable hierarchical patterns, main trunks branching down into smaller and smaller systems, the way a river splits into streams. This ship's wiring looped back on itself constantly, redundant pathways doubling and even tripling, in places that should have needed only a single line. At first, staring at the tangled schematic slowly assembling on my screen, I assumed it was simply poor design, wasteful, inefficient. Then, crouched beside an open panel with my scanner, tracing one particularly stubborn loop of cabling, something clicked into place in my mind, and I sat back on my heels, genuinely stunned by the simplicity of what I was looking at. It wasn't wasteful. It was survivable. Every redundant pathway meant that if one line failed, another could carry the load without the entire system collapsing. Every double junction meant a single point of damage couldn't cripple the whole network. This wasn't inefficient design. This was a ship built by someone who expected to take damage constantly and who refused to let any single failure become catastrophic. No wonder the engineering teams before me had struggled. They had been looking for elegance, for the clean, minimal efficiency most shipbuilders prized. Instead, they had found something built entirely around the assumption of constant, ongoing conflict, a philosophy of engineering so different from what they were used to that it simply hadn't made sense to them. It made perfect sense to me. I had spent years working salvage on ships that had been through disasters no manufacturer ever anticipated, rigging temporary fixes out of whatever materials were available, running backup systems through improvised pathways that no official manual would ever recommend. I didn't need elegance. I needed things that worked, even when they shouldn't. For the first time since stepping aboard, I actually smiled. "All right," I muttered, tracing another loop of cable with my fingers. "I think I understand you a little better now." The next several hours passed in a blur of careful, methodical work. I didn't try to fix anything yet. That would come later, once I understood more. Instead, I mapped. I traced every redundant pathway I could find, marking each junction, each doubled system, each strange, unfamiliar override switch tucked into places no standard engineer would think to look. By the time hunger finally pulled me back toward the airlock, my portable terminal held nearly triple the data it had that morning, and my mind was already racing ahead to tomorrow's work before I had even left the ship. Grace was waiting again near the observation corridor, though this time she wasn't alone. A short, wiry man with graying hair and sharp, curious eyes stood beside her, studying a data slate with obvious interest. "Owen, this is Callum Ashford," Grace said as I approached, pulling off my equipment gloves. "Retired fleet engineer. He used to work pre-collapse salvage contracts, back when that kind of work still paid well." Callum extended a hand, and I shook it, noting the rough calluses that matched my own. "Grace mentioned you might be dealing with layered redundancy architecture," he said without preamble. "Overlapping pathways, double junctions, systems that seem to loop back on themselves for no obvious reason." I blinked, genuinely startled. "How did you know that?" A faint, tired smile crossed his face. "Because I saw something similar exactly once before, almost 30 years ago, on a wreck nobody could properly identify either. Spent 6 months on that ship before my contract ran out of funding." He paused, studying me carefully. "Never got to finish understanding it. Always wondered what I missed." "You think this ship is similar?" "I think," Callum said slowly, "that you might have stumbled onto something a lot more interesting than simple salvage. Mind if I take a look at your data?" "Varet inane." I handed over my terminal without hesitation, and for the next hour, the three of us sat together in the observation corridor, while Callum scrolled through everything I had gathered, occasionally muttering to himself, occasionally asking sharp, precise questions that made me realize just how much I still had left to learn. "The reactor housing," he said eventually, tapping the relevant section on my display. "You said it responded to your scanner earlier. A faint hum, residual charge?" "Yes. That shouldn't be possible," he said quietly, more to himself than to either of us. "Not after this long without active maintenance. Unless—" He trailed off, and I leaned forward, unable to stop myself. "Unless what?" Callum looked up at me, and for the first time since he'd arrived, something like genuine excitement flickered behind his tired eyes. "Unless the reactor never actually stopped generating power. Unless it's simply been idling, conserving itself, waiting for someone to give it a reason to wake up fully." The words settled over the three of us in silence, heavier than they had any right to be. "That's not standard reactor behavior," I said finally. "No," Callum agreed. "It isn't. Which means whatever built this ship understood something about power generation that the rest of the galaxy either lost or never had in the first place." Grace, who had been quiet through most of this exchange, finally spoke up. "So what does that mean for tomorrow?" Callum looked back at me, and something in his expression shifted into quiet, serious respect. It means, Owen Hale, that you may have just accidentally uncovered the single most important salvage project this sector has seen in decades. And it means, if you're serious about this, you're going to need every bit of help you can get. I looked past him, through the observation glass, at the massive, silent hull waiting patiently in the docking bay beyond. Somewhere deep inside that ship, a reactor that should have been dead for years was quietly, patiently holding onto its charge, waiting. "I'm serious," I said quietly. "I'm not walking away from this." Callum nodded slowly, as if he had expected exactly that answer. "Good," he said. "Because if I'm right about what's sleeping in that hull, the galaxy is going to need someone who refuses to walk away." None of us knew yet just how true those words would turn out to be. But standing there in the dim light of the observation corridor, staring out at a ship that 3 separate engineering teams had declared impossible, I felt something settle inside me that hadn't been there before. Not certainty, exactly, but something close to it. Purpose. And somewhere behind that reinforced glass, deep within a hull built for a war none of us yet understood, something ancient and patient continued waiting, one quiet pulse of power at a time, for the moment it would finally be allowed to wake. By the end of the first week, I had stopped counting the hours I spent inside that ship. Time simply folded into itself down in those corridors, one panel leading to another, one discovery leading to 3 new questions, before I had even finished answering the last one. Callum joined me most days, though he was careful to remind me, more than once, that he was there to advise, not to take charge. "This is your project," he said on the 4th day, watching me splice together a bundle of wiring, using a technique I had more or less invented on the spot. "I'm just along for the ride." "You could take some of the credit," I pointed out. "Nobody would blame you." He shook his head, a small, amused smile on his face. "I spent 30 years wondering what I missed on that other wreck. I'm not interested in credit. I'm interested in finally getting an answer." I understood that feeling better than I expected to. There was something almost addictive about the way this ship refused to give up its secrets easily, the way every solved problem simply revealed a deeper, more interesting one underneath. Most salvage work I had done before this felt like following a checklist. This felt like solving a language nobody had spoken in centuries, one careful word at a time. The reactor became my primary focus once the mapping was mostly complete. Callum's theory about the idling power core turned out to be correct, though understanding why it worked that way took another 3 days of careful, methodical testing. "It's not one reactor," I finally said, sitting back against the cool metal wall of the core chamber, staring at the schematic glowing on my tablet. "It's dozens of smaller units, distributed throughout the hull, all feeding into a central regulator." Callum leaned over my shoulder, studying the display. "Explain." "Standard ships use 1 main reactor, sometimes 2 for redundancy," I said, tracing the pattern with my finger. "This ship spreads its power generation across the entire hull, small units, dozens of them, tucked into places no engineer would think to look. Individually, they're barely producing anything, but together they're producing enough to keep the whole system idling for years, without maintenance," Callum finished, his voice quiet, with something close to awe. "That's not just redundancy. That's a completely different philosophy of power generation. It means you can knock out half the reactors on this ship and it would barely notice," I said, the implications settling into place as I spoke them aloud. "There's no single point of failure, nothing to target, nothing to disable with 1 clean hit." Neither of us said the obvious next thought out loud, not yet, but it hung in the air between us regardless. A ship built with no single point of failure, engineered around constant conflict, designed by someone who assumed every system would eventually be damaged and needed a way to keep functioning anyway. This wasn't a cargo hauler. This wasn't a passenger transport that had simply been repurposed at some point in its long, mysterious history. This was built for a fight. Word of my progress had started spreading through the station by the 2nd week, though not in the way I expected. I assumed, given how thoroughly the ship had been dismissed by everyone before me, that any news of actual progress would be met with skepticism, or simply ignored altogether. Instead, I started noticing people watching me differently in the corridors. Not with the open mockery I had grown used to during the first few days, but with a kind of wary curiosity, the sort of look people give something they aren't quite sure how to categorize anymore. Grace noticed it too. "You're becoming a topic of conversation," she told me one evening, joining me in the station's small communal dining area while I ate a meal that tasted faintly of overcooked protein and not much else. Good conversation or bad conversation? Depends who you ask. She took a seat across from me, setting down her own tray. The dock workers think it's fascinating. A few of the trade brokers think you're either lucky or lying about your progress. And at least one of the engineering guilds that walked away from that ship originally is apparently not thrilled that a human mechanic might be succeeding where they failed. That last part caught my attention. Which guild? Meridian Systems, she said. They were the first contract, before the Salowin team, before whoever came after them. Word is, they're not happy about the attention you're getting. I hadn't given much thought to the previous engineering teams, beyond Varen and Dessa's warning during my first days on the project. Meridian Systems was a name I vaguely recognized from the ship's salvage records. A large, well-funded engineering firm with contracts across several sectors, the kind of company that didn't take failure well, especially not public failure. What exactly are they saying? Grace shrugged, though her expression suggested she was being deliberately careful with her words. Nothing official, just quiet grumbling in the right circles, that the ship was properly assessed and declared unsalvageable for good reason, that anyone claiming otherwise is either exaggerating or setting themselves up for a very public embarrassment. They think I'm going to fail. They're hoping you fail, Grace corrected. There's a difference. If a mechanic working alone succeeds where an entire engineering guild couldn't, that's not exactly good publicity for them. I considered that for a long moment, turning my fork over in my hand, without really eating. Should I be worried? Grace's expression shifted into something more serious. Meridian Systems doesn't usually get directly involved in salvage disputes, but they don't like being made to look incompetent, either. I'd just be careful. Keep your progress documented. Keep your access logs clean. If they do decide to make trouble, you'll want proof that everything you're doing is above board. I took her advice seriously, starting that same night. From then on, every repair, every discovery, every small victory got logged carefully in a private encrypted file, time-stamped and backed up across 3 separate storage drives. It felt excessive at the time. Later, I would be grateful I had listened. The following days brought slow, steady progress. With the reactor architecture finally understood, I turned my attention to the ship's primary computer core, the system every previous engineering team had listed as corrupted beyond standard recovery. Callum and I spent nearly 4 full days simply trying to establish a stable connection, working through layer after layer of unfamiliar security protocols that seemed designed less to protect the system and more to test whoever was trying to access it. "This isn't corruption," I said finally, late on the 4th day, staring at lines of unfamiliar code scrolling across my display. "This is encryption, deliberate, layered encryption." Callum leaned forward, studying the same lines with a furrowed brow. "You're certain?" "Look at the pattern," I said, pointing toward a section of the display. "Corrupted data is random, broken. This isn't random. It's structured, deliberate. Whoever built this system wanted to make absolutely sure that only the right person could ever access it." "Then, how do we get past it?" I sat back, staring at the screen for a long moment, an idea slowly forming that felt both obvious and slightly unsettling. "Maybe we don't try to break it," I said slowly. "Maybe we try to understand what it's actually asking for." Over the next 2 days, I approached the computer core differently, treating the encryption not as an obstacle to force through, but as a question waiting for the right answer. Slowly, patiently, I began mapping the structure of the security protocols themselves, looking not for weaknesses, but for patterns, repeated phrases, recurring symbols, subtle hints about what kind of access the system was actually designed to recognize. On the 7th day since first connecting to the core, something finally shifted. I had been running a diagnostic scan late in the evening more out of habit than expectation at that point, when a small section of the display flickered and changed. A single line of text appeared, translated roughly by my terminal's language processor, simple and unadorned. Operator authentication incomplete, awaiting biological confirmation. I stared at those words for a long, silent moment, my pulse quickening. "Callum," I called out, my voice tighter than I intended. "You need to see this." He hurried over from the far side of the chamber, reading the message twice, before looking up at me, his expression caught somewhere between excitement and genuine unease. "Biological confirmation," he repeated slowly. "That's not standard authentication language. That's a system waiting for someone specific," I finished quietly. We stood there in silence for a long moment, both of us staring at the small, unassuming line of text glowing on the display, understanding without needing to say it out loud that we had just crossed into territory far more significant than either of us had originally anticipated. "What do we do?" Callum asked finally. I thought about that question carefully before answering, my mind already working through the possibilities, the risks, the strange, unshakable feeling that had been building inside me since the very first moment I stepped aboard this ship. "We find out what it's actually asking for," I said, carefully, one step at a time. Outside the observation window, the docking bay lights dimmed for the station's night cycle, casting long shadows across the massive, silent hull, resting quietly in its berth. Somewhere deep inside that ship, a system that had waited patiently for longer than any of us could properly account for, had just, for the first time in who knew how many years, acknowledged that someone was finally listening. And whatever answer it was waiting for, I intended to find it. News of the message on the ship's computer core spread faster than I expected, though not because either Callum or I told anyone. Grace figured it out on her own within 2 days, simply by noticing the change in my behavior, the longer hours, the distracted way I picked at my meals, the way I kept glancing at my tablet even during conversations that had nothing to do with the ship. "You found something," she said one evening, sitting across from me in the dining hall, not bothering to phrase it as a question. I hesitated, weighing how much to share. Grace had helped me from the very beginning, had trusted me, before anyone else on this station had reason to. Keeping her in the dark felt wrong, even with Meridian systems supposedly watching from a distance. "The computer core is asking for biological authentication," I said quietly, keeping my voice low despite the mostly empty room. "It's not corrupted. It's locked, waiting for something specific." Grace's eyebrows rose slightly. "Waiting for what, exactly?" "I don't know yet. That's what I'm trying to figure out." She studied me for a long moment, something thoughtful crossing her expression. "Owen, be careful. A locked system that's specific usually means someone designed it that way on purpose. If it's waiting for a particular kind of confirmation, you need to think carefully about what happens if you get that confirmation wrong." Her warning stayed with me long after our conversation ended, echoing through my thoughts as I made my way back toward the docking bay the next morning. She was right, of course. Systems built with that level of deliberate security rarely responded well to guesswork. Callum was already waiting near the airlock when I arrived, a small case of diagnostic equipment slung over one shoulder. "I brought something that might help," he said by way of greeting. "Old fleet-issue biometric scanner. Might not be compatible, but it's worth trying before we attempt anything more invasive." We spent the better part of that day running careful, incremental tests against the authentication request, trying different combinations of biometric data, different scanning frequencies, anything that might trigger a useful response from the system without risking damage to the fragile, ancient hardware underneath. Nothing worked, not at first. The message remained exactly the same, patient and unmoving, regardless of what we tried. It was late in the afternoon, well past the point where most reasonable engineers would have called it a day, when I finally decided to try something simpler than anything we had attempted so far. I placed my bare hand flat against the primary interface panel, the same gesture I had used dozens of times before on standard ships to establish a basic manual connection, more out of habit than genuine expectation. The panel hummed beneath my palm. I froze, watching as the display flickered, then steadied, new lines of translated text scrolling rapidly across the screen, faster than I could properly read them all. Biological signature detected. Cross-referencing operator database. Please stand by. Callum, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, though the urgency in it was unmistakable. He hurried over immediately, reading the message over my shoulder, his breath catching audibly. For nearly a full minute, nothing happened. The two of us stood frozen, watching the small progress indicator pulse steadily on the display, neither of us willing to break the silence. Then the text changed again. Operator database unavailable. Insufficient historical records for confirmation. Proceeding with provisional authorization. The lights in the chamber flickered once, twice, then steadied into a soft, pale glow neither of us had seen before, illuminating sections of the room that had been dark since I first stepped aboard. Somewhere deep within the hull, a low, steady hum began building, faint at first, then growing stronger with each passing second. "It's waking up," Callum breathed, disbelief and excitement warring openly on his face. "Owen, it's actually waking up." I stood there, hand still pressed against the interface panel, feeling something vibrate faintly beneath my palm, a pulse of energy that seemed to travel outward through the deck plating itself, spreading through the ship like a heartbeat, finally remembering how to beat. We didn't sleep that night. Instead, we stayed aboard, cautiously exploring sections of the ship that had been completely dark and inaccessible until that moment, watching as more and more systems flickered slowly back to life around us. Lighting strips activated in corridors we hadn't even known existed. Environmental systems hummed back into operation, clearing away the last of the stale, recycled air that had lingered since the ship first went dark. By the time station morning arrived, word had somehow already reached the docking authority that lights were visible aboard the previously dead hull in berth 19. I emerged from the airlock exhausted, filthy, and grinning despite myself, to find a small crowd gathered near the observation corridor. Grace was there, along with several dock workers, a pair of curious Kathrani traders, and, standing slightly apart from the rest, two figures I didn't immediately recognize, dressed in the crisp, formal attire of a corporate engineering delegation. "Meridian Systems," Grace murmured under her breath as I approached, confirming my suspicion before I could ask. The taller of the two representatives, a stern-faced man with sharp eyes, stepped forward as I reached the group. "Owen Hale," he said, his tone carrying the particular blend of professional courtesy and thinly veiled hostility I had come to associate with corporate representatives who weren't happy about something. "My name is Desmond Vale. I represent Meridian Systems Engineering." "I know who you represent," I said evenly, too tired and too satisfied with the previous night's progress to bother with diplomacy. I didn't feel like extending. Vale's expression tightened slightly at my tone, though he kept his voice level. "We've received reports of significant activity aboard the vessel you recently acquired. Given that Meridian Systems previously held the original salvage contract on that ship, we would appreciate the opportunity to review your progress." "You walked away from that contract," I pointed out. "Voluntarily terminated it, according to the salvage registry." "Circumstances have changed," Vale said smoothly. "We're prepared to offer a generous buyout of your current ownership stake, along with fair compensation for the work you've already completed." I studied him for a long moment, genuinely curious despite myself. Why the sudden interest? 3 days ago that ship was worthless. Now it's suddenly worth a generous buyout. Vale's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, the first genuine crack in his otherwise polished composure. "Meridian Systems believes the vessel may hold historical and technological significance that was not fully appreciated during our initial assessment." Translation, I realized, was simple enough. Word had reached them that I was succeeding, and they didn't like the idea of a lone mechanic outperforming their entire engineering guild on a project they had publicly abandoned. "I appreciate the offer," I said, keeping my voice carefully polite despite the satisfaction building somewhere beneath my exhaustion. "But I'm not selling." Something flickered behind Vale's eyes, cold and calculating, though his expression remained outwardly composed. "I would encourage you to reconsider, Mr. Hale. Salvage projects of this scale often attract complications, that a single independent operator isn't equipped to handle. The threat, thinly veiled as it was, hung in the air between us for a long moment. Grace shifted slightly beside me, her posture tensing, though she said nothing. "I'll take my chances," I said finally. Vale held my gaze a moment longer, then gave a short, stiff nod, the kind that carried more warning than agreement. "As you wish. We'll be monitoring your progress with great interest." He and his companion turned and left without another word, their footsteps echoing sharply down the corridor until the sound faded entirely. The small crowd that had gathered slowly dispersed as well, leaving Grace and me standing alone near the observation glass, staring after the departed representatives. "That went about as well as I expected," Grace said finally, breaking the tense silence. "You expected them to threaten me. I expected them to try buying you out first, and threatening you second, once that failed," she corrected, "which is exactly what happened. You should be careful, Owen. Companies like Meridian don't take rejection well, especially not public rejection in front of witnesses." I glanced back toward the docking bay, where the ship sat quietly, its newly restored lights casting a soft, steady glow across the reinforced glass separating us. Despite the exhaustion pulling at my limbs, despite the very real concern settling into my thoughts about what Meridian Systems might attempt next, I felt something else too, something stubborn and unshakable that had been building steadily since the very first day I placed that winning bid. "I've come too far to stop now," I said quietly, more to myself than to Grace. She studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly, understanding written clearly across her tired, thoughtful expression. "Then we'd better make sure you're documenting everything," she said. "Because if they're going to try to make trouble, we're going to make absolutely certain they can't twist a single fact in their favor." Over the following days, my careful record-keeping habit became something closer to obsession. Every repair, every discovery, every moment of the ship's slow, steady reawakening got logged, time-stamped, and backed up across multiple secure locations, just as Grace had suggested weeks earlier. It turned out to be a decision that mattered more than I could have possibly anticipated at the time. Because less than a week later, someone attempted to sabotage my access credentials to the docking bay, and if not for those careful records, proving my innocence against the accusations that followed might have been far more difficult than it ultimately was. But that particular battle was still a few days away, for now, standing in the observation corridor with Grace beside me and the ship humming quietly with newly restored life just beyond the glass, all I could think about was what waited deeper inside that hull, patiently revealing itself, one careful discovery at a time. Whatever Meridian Systems intended to do next, I was determined not to let it stop me from finding out exactly what kind of ship I had actually bought. The sabotage attempt happened on a quiet evening, 4 days after Desmond Vale and his Meridian Systems delegation walked away from the docking bay, with thinly veiled threats hanging in the air behind them. I had just finished a long stretch of work mapping the ship's newly active secondary systems when my wrist display flashed an alert I had never seen before. "Access credentials revoked. Docking Bay 19 restricted." I stared at the message for a long moment, genuinely confused, before hurrying toward the nearest station terminal to check what had happened. The docking authorities' log showed a clear, unambiguous record. My credentials had been flagged for review following an anonymous report alleging unauthorized modifications to station infrastructure. My stomach dropped. Unauthorized modifications carried serious penalties on a station like this, the kind that could result in confiscation of property, or worse. Grace found me 20 minutes later, still standing at the terminal, scrolling frantically through the flagged report trying to understand exactly what I was being accused of. "They're saying I rerouted power from the station's primary grid," I told her, my voice tight with a mixture of confusion and growing anger. "That I've been drawing unauthorized power to run tests on the ship." Grace leaned over my shoulder, reading the accusation carefully. "That's not possible. Every test you've run has used the ship's own internal power. You've been documenting exactly that from day one." "I know that, but someone filed this report anonymously, and the docking authority is required to investigate before restoring access." She straightened, her expression hardening into something I hadn't seen from her before, sharp and determined. Pull up your logs. All of them. Every timestamp, every power reading, everything you've recorded since the day you first boarded. It took nearly 2 hours to compile everything into a formal appeal, cross-referencing my careful records against the station's own infrastructure monitoring data, proving beyond any reasonable doubt that not a single watt of power had been drawn from anywhere other than the ship's own newly restored reactors. We submitted the appeal just before midnight station time, and then there was nothing to do but wait. The following morning brought a summons to appear before the station's oversight committee, a small panel of administrators responsible for resolving exactly this kind of dispute. I arrived early, Grace beside me, both of us carrying data slates loaded with every piece of evidence we had gathered overnight. Desmond Vale was already there when I arrived, seated near the back of the small hearing chamber, his expression carefully neutral, despite what I strongly suspected was his hand behind the entire accusation. He offered a polite, professional nod as I entered, the gesture somehow more infuriating than open hostility would have been. The hearing itself moved quickly once it began. The committee reviewed the anonymous report, then my submitted evidence, comparing timestamps and power readings with careful, methodical attention. I watched their expressions shift gradually from cautious skepticism to something closer to quiet respect, as the data made my position increasingly, undeniably clear. The evidence presented by Mr. Hale conclusively demonstrates that all power draws associated with the vessel in question originated from the ship's own internal systems, the lead administrator finally announced, her tone carrying the particular flat formality reserved for official rulings. The anonymous accusation is dismissed as unfounded. Access credentials will be restored immediately. A quiet murmur passed through the small gathered audience. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, relief flooding through me so suddenly it left me almost lightheaded. The administrator continued, her gaze shifting pointedly toward the back of the room where Vale sat. The committee would also like to note, for the record, that filing false accusations against a licensed salvage operator carries significant penalties under station code. We would strongly advise whoever submitted this anonymous report to reconsider any future attempts at similar interference. Vale's expression remained carefully composed, though I caught the faint tightening around his eyes that suggested the warning had landed exactly where it was intended. Grace and I left the hearing chamber together, and once we were safely out of earshot in the corridor beyond, she finally let out the tension she had been holding through the entire proceeding. "That was close," she said quietly. "If you hadn't kept those records—" "I know," I said. "I owe you for that advice." She waved off the gratitude, though a small, satisfied smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "Just make sure you keep documenting everything. This isn't going to be the last attempt, Owen. Vale isn't the type to give up after one failed move." She was right, of course, though the next several days passed without any further incident, giving me the chance to return to the ship with renewed focus and, if I was honest with myself, a stubborn determination sharpened rather than dulled by the recent trouble. The reactor systems continued stabilizing steadily throughout that week, each restored subsystem revealing new sections of the ship that had been completely inaccessible before. Corridors I hadn't even known existed opened up as environmental controls came back online, leading deeper into the hull than I had originally mapped. It was during one of these expanded explorations, nearly 3 weeks after I first placed my winning bid, that I found the chamber that would ultimately change everything. Tucked deep within the ship's central spine, accessible only through a heavily reinforced corridor that had remained sealed until the ship's systems restored enough power to unlock it, was a chamber unlike anything else aboard the vessel. Unlike the utilitarian, redundancy-focused engineering that dominated every other section of the ship, this room felt different, deliberate in a way that suggested significance beyond simple function. The walls were lined with what looked like storage housing, dozens of sealed compartments arranged in careful, symmetrical rows. At the center of the chamber stood a raised platform, and above it, suspended in some kind of stabilizing field, hovered a compact, densely constructed device unlike anything in my technical knowledge. I approached slowly, my scanner practically screaming with readings I had never encountered before. Whatever this device was, it was drawing power directly from the ship's central reactor network. more power than any single system I had encountered so far, concentrated into a housing barely larger than my torso. Callum arrived 20 minutes after I called him, and I watched his expression shift from curiosity to something close to stunned disbelief as he took in the chamber around us. "Owen," he said slowly, his voice hushed, almost reverent, "do you understand what you've found?" "Not yet," I admitted. "But I think it's important." He moved closer to the central platform, studying the suspended device with careful, cautious fascination. "This isn't standard equipment. This isn't even remotely standard. The power draw alone suggests this single device could rival entire weapons platforms found on modern capital ships." The word weapons settled heavily in the quiet chamber, confirming a suspicion that had been building steadily in the back of my mind since the very first day I discovered the ship's redundant, damage-resistant architecture. "This ship wasn't just built to survive conflict," I said slowly, understanding solidifying with each word. "It was built to win conflict, decisively." Callum nodded slowly, his expression caught somewhere between excitement and genuine unease. "If this device functions the way I suspect it might, then whoever built this vessel possessed technology far beyond anything currently active in known galactic engineering." We spent the following hours carefully documenting every detail of the chamber, running scans, recording measurements, cautiously avoiding any direct interaction with the suspended device itself, until we understood far more about what exactly we were dealing with. It was late that evening, back in the relative safety of the station's communal areas, that the full weight of the discovery truly settled over me. Grace listened intently as Callum and I recounted everything we had found, her expression growing increasingly serious with each new detail. "You need to be extremely careful about who knows about this," she said finally, once we finished explaining. "If Meridian Systems learns you've found something like this, the buyout offers and anonymous accusations are going to look like gentle warnings compared to what comes next." "I know," I said quietly, "but I'm not stopping now, not after everything I've already found." Grace studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly, understanding written clearly in her tired, thoughtful expression. "Then we protect what you've found, carefully, quietly. And we make sure that whatever happens next, you're the one controlling how this information gets revealed, not someone else." Outside the station's viewport, the vast darkness of space stretched endlessly beyond the reinforced glass, indifferent to the discovery that had just fundamentally changed everything about the ship, resting quietly in Berth 19. Somewhere deep within that hull, a device capable of power beyond current galactic understanding waited patiently in its stabilizing field, one careful step closer to finally being understood. And somewhere out in that same vast darkness, forces far larger and far more dangerous than a single corporate engineering firm were already beginning to take notice of the strange, quiet activity happening aboard a ship that everyone had once dismissed as worthless. None of us yet understood just how soon that attention would arrive, or how drastically it would change everything that followed. 3 days after discovering the central chamber, I finally worked up the confidence to attempt a careful, controlled activation of the suspended device. Callum stood beside me at a safe distance, monitoring the ship's power distribution on a portable terminal, while Grace waited just outside the reinforced corridor, ready to trigger an emergency shutdown of the entire section if anything went wrong. We had spent those 3 days running every diagnostic test we could think of, cross-referencing the device's power signature against every database Callum could access, trying to understand as much as possible before risking direct interaction. The results had been simultaneously enlightening and deeply unsettling. Whatever this device was, it wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense. It didn't fire projectiles, didn't generate the kind of destructive energy discharge typically associated with capital ship armaments. Instead, based on the strange, layered readings my scanner kept returning, it seemed to function as some kind of amplification system, drawing power from the ship's distributed reactor network and converting it into something my instruments struggled to properly categorize. "Last chance to back out," Callum said quietly, watching me approach the central platform. "Not backing out," I said, though my hands weren't entirely steady as I reached toward the interface panel built into the platform's base. The moment my palm made contact, the entire chamber shifted. Soft light emanated from the walls, tracing patterns along the sealed storage compartments that I hadn't noticed before. Geometric shapes that pulsed gently in sequence, almost like the chamber itself was breathing. Operator confirmed, the ship's translated voice announced, through a speaker system I hadn't even known was functional. Central amplification array reactivating, please stand by. The suspended device began to hum, low and steady at first, then building in intensity until the entire chamber seemed to vibrate with contained energy. I stepped back instinctively, watching as the stabilizing field around the device shifted color, deep blue giving way to something brighter, more electric. Owen, Callum's voice carried a note of genuine alarm. Power draw just spiked across every reactor in the ship simultaneously. Is it dangerous? I don't know yet, he admitted, but it's definitely not idling anymore. For nearly a full minute, the chamber remained locked in that state, energy building steadily, the hum growing louder without ever quite reaching a level that felt threatening. Then, gradually, the intensity began to level off, stabilizing into a steady, controlled pulse that matched the rhythm of the ship's own reactivated systems. Amplification array fully operational, the voice announced, awaiting further instruction. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, relief washing through me as the immediate tension in the chamber finally eased. Callum, what exactly did we just activate? He was already scrolling through his terminal, cross-referencing the new readings against everything we had gathered so far, his expression shifting into something between fascination and dawning understanding. I think, he said slowly, we just brought this ship's true purpose fully online, for the first time in who knows how many years. We didn't get the chance to explore that purpose further that day. The station's emergency alert system activated less than an hour later, an urgent, station-wide broadcast that pulled every available hand toward the primary docking hub. An unidentified fleet had emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the system, moving with clear, deliberate aggression toward the station and its surrounding traffic. Initial scans suggested a raiding force, the kind of opportunistic hostile group that occasionally targeted remote outposts like this one, drawn by the promise of valuable salvage and minimal organized defense. I made my way toward the docking bay immediately, Grace and Callum close behind, weaving through corridors filled with station personnel scrambling toward defensive positions that, from what I could tell listening to the emergency broadcasts, were woefully inadequate against a coordinated raiding fleet. They're targeting the outer docking rings first, Grace said, reading updates from her wrist display as we hurried through the crowded corridors. Standard raider tactics, disable defenses, then move in for salvage and hostages. The station's meager defense fleet, 3 aging patrol vessels never designed for real combat, launched to meet the incoming threat, their pilots' voices crackling with barely concealed tension over the open comm channels. I reached the observation deck just in time to see the first exchange of fire light up the darkness beyond the station, brief flashes of energy discharge illuminating the void as the outnumbered patrol ships tried desperately to hold the line. It wasn't going well. Within minutes, one of the patrol vessels went dark entirely, drifting silently away from the fight, its systems apparently disabled rather than destroyed outright. The raiding fleet pressed forward, undeterred, clearly intent on reaching the station itself. I felt something cold and urgent settle into my chest, watching the battle unfold beyond the reinforced glass. The station's remaining defenses weren't going to be enough. Everyone here, everyone who had watched me struggle and succeed over the past 3 weeks, everyone who had helped me along the way, was in genuine danger. And somewhere in Berth 19, resting quietly with its reactors fully restored, and its central amplification array freshly activated for the first time in years, sat a ship that 3 separate engineering teams had once declared completely worthless. Grace, I said, already turning away from the observation window, I need to get back to the ship. She grabbed my arm before I could move further, her expression caught between concern and something that looked almost like understanding. Owen, that ship isn't combat ready. You don't even know what half its systems actually do yet. I know enough, I said, and even as I spoke the words, I felt the truth of them settling into certainty. I know its power systems can handle sustained damage without failing. I know it's built to survive exactly this kind of situation. And right now, it's the only thing on this station with any chance of actually making a difference. Callum stepped forward, his expression grim but resolute. I'm coming with you. You'll need someone monitoring systems while you're focused on piloting. This isn't your fight, I told him. It stopped being just your fight the moment I decided to help you understand that ship, he said firmly. Now stop arguing and let's move. We ran through the station's increasingly chaotic corridors, dodging past personnel rushing toward emergency shelters, past station security, trying to maintain order amid the mounting panic. By the time we reached berth 19, the sounds of distant weapons fire had grown noticeably louder, close enough now that I could feel faint vibrations traveling through the station's deck, plating with each impact. The ship's airlock cycled open the moment I approached, systems responding instantly now that full power had been restored throughout the hull. Callum and I hurried aboard, making our way as quickly as possible toward what I had identified weeks earlier as the primary command deck, a section of the ship I had only partially explored until now. The command deck itself took my breath away, even in the urgency of the moment. Unlike the utilitarian corridors elsewhere in the ship, this space felt deliberately designed for a single operator, a curved command chair positioned at the center of a wide array of interface panels, all of it dark and waiting until the moment I settled into the seat and placed my hands against the primary controls. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every display around me flared to life simultaneously, information flooding across the panels faster than I could consciously process, though somehow, impossibly, I found myself understanding it anyway, as if the ship itself was guiding my instincts toward exactly what I needed to know. Operator confirmed. Full system access granted. Combat readiness at 73% and rising. Callum, I called out, my voice steady, despite the racing pulse in my chest. I need you monitoring the reactor network. Tell me immediately if anything spikes beyond safe parameters. Already on it, he called back from the secondary station he had claimed nearby, his own display already lit up with power readings. I took a steadying breath, feeling the ship respond to my thoughts with an intuitive ease that should have been impossible for a vessel I had only partially understood, and guided it slowly, carefully away from its berth, out into the growing chaos of the battle unfolding just beyond the station. The raiding fleet's sensors clearly registered my approach, though based on the lack of any immediate reaction, they apparently dismissed the ship as irrelevant, exactly as everyone else had for years. That assumption, I suspected, was about to prove very costly for them. I guided the ship forward, watching as one of the raiding vessels broke away from the main formation to intercept, clearly expecting an easy, one-sided engagement against what still looked, from the outside, like a barely functional salvage wreck. Owen! Callum's voice carried unmistakable tension. Incoming fire, brace for impact. The enemy vessel's weapons discharged, a bright pulse of destructive energy streaking directly toward us. I braced instinctively, expecting damage, expecting the kind of hull-shaking impact I had experienced on lesser ships during years of salvage work. Instead, the ship's distributed shielding absorbed the impact almost effortlessly, the ship barely shuddering under an attack that should have caused significant damage to any standard vessel of comparable size. Shield integrity at 98%, the ship's voice announced calmly. For the first time since launching from the docking bay, I felt something shift inside me, certainty replacing the anxious uncertainty that had carried me this far. This ship, dismissed and abandoned by everyone who had touched it before me, was exactly what Callum's earlier words had suggested weeks ago. It hadn't been built to simply survive conflict. It had been built to end it. Let's show them exactly what they're dealing with, I said quietly, guiding the ship forward into the heart of the battle, the amplification array humming steadily beneath the command deck, ready, finally, after years of patient waiting, to reveal exactly what it had been built for. The raiding vessel that had broken away to intercept me fired a second volley, clearly recalculating its approach after the first attack failed to produce any visible damage. I watched the incoming fire on my display, feeling the ship's systems anticipate the trajectory almost before I consciously registered it myself, adjusting our path with a smooth, effortless precision that felt less like piloting and more like moving in perfect harmony with something ancient and patient. "Shields holding steady," Callum called out from his station, his voice tight with focused concentration. "Reactor output climbing, but well within safe parameters." I guided the ship closer, watching the enemy vessel grow larger on my display, its weapons continuing to fire in increasingly desperate bursts, as it apparently began to realize this engagement wasn't unfolding the way its crew had expected. The amplification array beneath the command deck pulsed steadily, and with each pulse, I felt new understanding settle into my thoughts, as if the ship itself was slowly teaching me exactly how to use everything it offered. "Owen, the array is drawing power toward the forward hull section," Callum reported, studying his readings carefully. "I think it's preparing some kind of response system." I trusted that instinct building steadily inside me, the same instinct that had guided me through weeks of impossible repairs, and reached toward a section of the command interface that hadn't lit up until this exact moment. The ship responded immediately, forward hull plating shifting subtly, revealing systems that had remained completely hidden until now. "Defensive countermeasure array online," the ship's calm voice announced, awaiting operator confirmation to engage. I hesitated only briefly before giving the confirmation, watching as a focused pulse of energy, gathered and shaped by the very amplification array Callum and I had activated just hours earlier, streaked outward from the ship's forward hull toward the attacking vessel. The effect was immediate and unmistakable. The enemy ship's weapons systems flickered and died mid-discharge, its engines sputtering as whatever the pulse had done rippled visibly across its hull. Within seconds, the vessel drifted to a complete stop, all visible power signatures fading to nothing. "It's disabled," Callum said, disbelief evident in his voice as he studied the readings. "Not destroyed, disabled. Every system just shut down simultaneously." I stared at the display, understanding slowly dawning alongside my own surprise. The countermeasure hadn't been designed to destroy. It had been designed to end a fight decisively, without unnecessary destruction, a precise, controlled response, built by whoever had originally engineered this vessel, with a philosophy I was only beginning to understand. The rest of the raiding fleet, watching their companion vessel go dark in mere seconds, began adjusting their formation, several ships breaking away from their assault on the station entirely to redirect their attention toward the ship I now piloted. "They're coming for us," Callum warned. "Good," I said, and meant it. Every ship that turned its attention toward me was one less ship threatening the station, one less threat to Grace and everyone else who had shown me kindness over the past 3 weeks. I guided the ship forward to meet the approaching threats head-on, watching as 3 separate vessels opened fire simultaneously, their combined assault far more serious than the single ship I had disabled moments earlier. The ship's shields absorbed the initial barrage without difficulty, though I noticed the integrity reading drop several percentage points, a reminder that even this remarkable vessel had limits. "Distribute power evenly across all reactor clusters," I said, the instruction coming to me with a clarity that surprised even myself, as if the ship's own design logic had somehow become intuitive through the hours I had spent understanding its architecture. "Keep the amplification array charged for another countermeasure pulse." Callum worked quickly at his station, adjusting the distribution exactly as I requested, and I felt the ship respond immediately, shields strengthening, the amplification array building steadily toward another discharge. The 3 attacking vessels pressed their assault, clearly coordinating their formation in an attempt to overwhelm whatever defenses I possessed through sheer concentrated firepower. I held steady, watching the amplification array's charge indicator climb toward full readiness, trusting the ship's own patient, redundant engineering to hold against the sustained attack. When the array finally reached full charge, I released a wider pulse than before, one that spread outward in a controlled arc rather than a single focused beam. All 3 attacking vessels shuddered as the countermeasure swept across them, their weapons fire faltering, engines stuttering, entire systems flickering and dimming in rapid succession. Within moments, all 3 ships drifted powerless, exactly like the first, disabled rather than destroyed, their crews presumably alive and unharmed, but no longer capable of continuing the assault. Across the remaining battlefield, the rest of the raiding fleet began breaking formation entirely, apparently recognizing that whatever they had assumed about this station's defenses had just been proven catastrophically wrong. Several vessels turned and fled outright, engines flaring as they retreated back toward the edge of the system and the safety of hyperspace beyond. "They're withdrawing," Callum reported, relief evident in his voice as he watched the readings shift. "Owen, they're actually withdrawing." I guided the ship in a slow, careful sweep across the battlefield, making certain no further threats remained, watching as the station's own patrol vessels, badly damaged but still functional, began the careful process of securing the disabled raider ships for eventual recovery and interrogation. By the time I finally guided the ship back toward its berth in the station's docking ring, the emergency alert had shifted from active combat to recovery and assessment, the immediate crisis over as quickly and decisively as it had begun. Grace was waiting at the airlock when I finally emerged, her expression a complicated mixture of relief, disbelief, and something that looked remarkably close to pride. "You disabled 4 raiding vessels without firing a single lethal shot," she said, shaking her head slowly. "Do you have any idea what that means?" "I have some idea," I admitted, still feeling the adrenaline of the encounter slowly draining from my system, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion I hadn't fully noticed until this exact moment. Word of what had happened spread through the station with remarkable speed over the following hours. By evening, station administrators had already requested a full account of the engagement, eager to understand exactly what kind of vessel had single-handedly turned the tide of a battle their own defense fleet had been rapidly losing. Desmond Vale, I later learned, had watched the entire engagement from the station's secondary observation deck, and according to Grace, his carefully composed corporate demeanor had cracked visibly the moment my ship disabled its first opponent. Whatever plans Meridian Systems had been quietly developing regarding my continued ownership of the vessel, I suspected, were about to require significant reconsideration. That evening, sitting exhausted in the station's dining hall with Grace and Callum beside me, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened since I first placed that winning bid, barely a month earlier. A ship that everyone had declared worthless, a project that every rational engineer had walked away from, a vessel 3 separate teams had abandoned as impossible. And somehow, through nothing more than patience, careful understanding, and a stubborn refusal to accept the word impossible without checking for myself, I had turned that same worthless wreck into something that had just single-handedly defended an entire station against a coordinated raiding fleet. "What happens now?" Callum asked quietly, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled over our small table. I thought about that question for a long moment before answering, watching through the dining hall's viewport as the last of the disabled raider vessels were slowly towed toward the station's holding bay, their crews already being processed by station security. "Now," I said finally, "everyone who ever looked at that ship and saw nothing but scrap is going to have to explain how they missed what it actually was." Grace smiled at that, small and genuine. "And what about you? What happens to Owen Hale, the mechanic who fixed the impossible?" I considered the question seriously, thinking about the weeks of careful, patient work that had brought me to this exact moment, thinking about the amplification array, humming quietly back in berth 19, still holding secrets I hadn't yet had the chance to fully explore, thinking about a galaxy that had spent generations underestimating exactly what patient, stubborn human hands were capable of accomplishing when given something everyone else had already given up on. "I think," I said slowly, a small, tired smile finally breaking through my exhaustion, "this is really just the beginning. Outside the viewport, beyond the slowly settling chaos of the recovery efforts, my ship rested quietly in its berth, its lights glowing steady and strong, for the first time in longer than anyone could properly account for. Somewhere deep within that hull, an ancient, patient intelligence that had waited years for someone willing to understand it had finally found exactly what it had been waiting for. And somewhere out across the vast, indifferent darkness of the galaxy, word was already beginning to spread of a human mechanic who had turned a forgotten, rejected wreck into something the rest of the galaxy would soon learn to call, with equal parts fear and reluctant respect, its mightiest superweapon,